At 14:07 and 33 seconds, SPY-6 radar aboard USS Delbert D. Black detects 44 inbound contacts spreading across 2 carrier sectors at the same time, and every defensive system in both strike groups turns toward a picture it was never designed to solve. 18 one-way attack drones are driving in on USS Abraham Lincoln from bearing 041. 18 more are descending toward USS Gerald Ford from bearing 302. 4 sea-skimming cruise missiles are cutting low toward Ford's outer screen, and 4 high-altitude ballistic tracks are rising between the 2 formations as if the main attack is centered on the gap. The Aegis combat system begins sorting the raid exactly as doctrine expects, assigning the nearest threats to the nearest escorts and preparing each carrier to turn away from the heaviest axis of approach. The system was designed to defeat attacks on ships. It was not designed to stop an attack on the distance between ships. Abraham Lincoln and Gerald Ford have 7 minutes and 26 seconds before their separation opens beyond 212 nautical miles, and the second phase of the Iranian plan becomes possible. At 14:07 and 41 seconds, Delbert D. Black pushes the first fire control quality tracks to both groups. Abraham Lincoln's escorts commit SM-2s against the northern drone axis. Ford's screen assigns 2 SM-6 interceptors to the cruise missiles and begins building long-range solutions on the 4 ballistic contacts climbing between the carriers. On both bridges, the first maneuver orders go out almost automatically because the radar picture appears straightforward. Yet Abraham Lincoln begins a 17-degree turn to starboard to unmask her eastern escort screen. Gerald Ford begins a 19-degree turn to port to widen the intercept lane for the cruise missiles cutting across her bow. Individually, both decisions are correct. Together, they are exactly what Iran wanted. At 14:08 and 02 seconds, the first SM-6 leaves USS Mitcher's vertical launch cell and climbs on Ford's western sector. 4 seconds later, the second missile follows. At 14:08 and 11 seconds, Abraham Lincoln's formation fires the first wave of SM-2s into the northern drone stream. The defensive sequence is clean, track quality is strong. The first 8 contacts die exactly where the system says they should die. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. Iran had not built a raid designed to penetrate both carrier strike groups in the first wave. Iran had built a raid designed to make both carrier strike groups maneuver away from each other while believing they were preserving themselves. To understand this, you need to understand how 2 carriers were operating that afternoon. Abraham Lincoln and Gerald Ford were not sailing side by side. They were fighting as a linked battle space, staggered just close enough for overlapping E-2D radar support, overlapping cooperative engagement capability tracks, overlapping destroyer coverage, and alternating launch cycles that let one carrier keep aircraft airborne while the other reset deck operations. So long as the distance stayed below roughly 190 nautical miles, one formation's sensors could help the other formation shoot, sort, and survive. Push that distance past 212 nautical miles under combat maneuver, and the overlap starts to tear. The radar picture is still there, but the quality drops. Intercept geometry degrades. Time to share a clean track increases. The carriers do not become helpless, they become separate. That was the real target. Iran did not design the attack to defeat both carrier strike groups at once. Iran designed it to split them into 2 smaller problems. Chief Warrant Officer Claire Mercer had been thinking about that for 26 days. Mercer was not the air defense commander. She was not a ship captain, a fighter pilot, or the tactical action officer standing at the center of the Combat Information Center. She worked in data link management aboard Delbert D. Black, where her job was to maintain track quality, connectivity, and the invisible mesh that turned scattered ships and aircraft into one firing network. During a workup drill in the Western Pacific, Mercer had written a 12-page assessment with the title nobody remembered until this afternoon, Distance as a Weapon. Her argument was simple. If Iran ever faced two carriers in the same theater, it would not waste its best weapons trying to break two screens at the same moment. It would use cheap threats, timed from multiple bearings, to herd the carriers into opposite maneuvers, then fire the real strike when their shared defensive picture degraded just enough to matter. The assessment was reviewed, acknowledged, and filed. No one rejected it, no one acted on it. The working assumption across the force was that any attack big enough to threaten two carriers would be obvious. Mercer's paper argued the opposite. The more dangerous attack would look manageable until the geometry changed. At 14:08 and 29 seconds, Ford's two SM-6 kill the incoming cruise missiles 21 nautical miles from the outer screen. At 14:08 and 34 seconds, Abraham Lincoln's escorts destroy another 11 drones. The first phase looks like a textbook success. 14 of the original 44 contacts are gone. Then Mercer sees the one thing the tactical displays are not built to emphasize. The two carriers are separating faster than the original maneuver estimate predicted. Abraham Lincoln's turn and acceleration are pulling her southeast at 31 knots. Gerald Ford's evasive shift is carrying her northwest at 29 knots. The distance between the carriers, 176 nautical miles at first detection, is now 184. At 14:08 and 43 seconds, it reaches 188. At 14:08 and 51 seconds, it reaches 191. The first ballistic track breaks apart under SM-6 intercept, and nobody in CIC is alarmed because that is what should happen. The second ballistic track follows 6 seconds later. Debris, kill confirmed. But Mercer is not watching the kills. She is watching three 0.5-second burst transmissions appearing on passive receivers from the merchant traffic lane running south of the center line between the two carrier groups. The emissions are narrow, synchronized, and identical to the relay logic she described 26 days earlier. Not command radar, not civilian clutter, mid-course timing bursts. At 14:09 and 04 seconds, she lays the emissions over the common operating picture and sees the pattern instantly. The bursts are not keyed to where the carriers are. They are keyed to where the carriers will be if both continue their current evasive turns for another 3 minutes. She picks up the circuit to the air defense coordinator and gives the shortest explanation possible. The raid is herding the carriers apart. The relays are updating future geometry. The answer comes back the way answers come back in the middle of a clean defensive engagement. Stand by. At 14:09 and 19 seconds, the separation reaches 196 nautical miles. The E-2D orbit supporting both formations is still holding a fused picture, but the track refresh rate on shared low-altitude contacts is already slipping. Mercer opens the relay angle again. 3 small surface contacts in the merchant lane, one drifting at 5 knots, one at 7, one at 4. Civilian hull signatures, military timing. She does not need to know what they are. Where she only needs to know what they are doing. At 14:09 and 31 seconds, the last surviving drones in Ford's sector are destroyed. On Abraham Lincoln's side, the final northern drone track disappears 9 seconds later. The first wave is over. Both carrier groups should be settling. Instead, the two formations are now 201 nautical miles apart and still widening. That is when the real attack begins. At 14:09 and 46 seconds, SPY-6 on Delbert D. Black detects 4 new launch signatures rising from the Iranian coast, 287 kilometers to the north. The ballistic climb is steeper than the earlier decoys. The acceleration is higher. The track quality is worse because the launch comes at the exact moment the two strike groups are finishing separate defensive turns and rebuilding local sectors. Aegis classifies the new contacts as 4 anti-ship ballistic missiles and begins projecting impact baskets against both carriers. The initial solution shows 2 weapons toward Abraham Lincoln, 2 toward Gerald Ford. Mercer stares at the projected baskets and sees the flaw immediately. The missiles are not aimed at either carrier's current position. They are aimed at where each carrier will be 2 minutes and 41 seconds later if both groups keep sailing apart on their present headings. Iran had used 44 cheap and expendable contacts to program the movements of 2 nuclear carriers before the real missiles ever left the launcher. That is what made the attack dangerous. The defensive systems were working. The carriers were surviving, and all of it was still feeding the larger design. At 14:10 and 02 seconds, Mercer calls again. The predicted baskets are built on our own maneuver. If Lincoln and Ford keep separating, the missiles arrive to solved coordinates. This time, the tactical action officer answers himself. Can you prove it? Mercer does not waste time trying to prove it in the academic sense. She gives the only number that matters. If both groups reverse inward now, the missiles lose 23 nautical miles of solved geometry, and the relay boats have 1 update cycle left. There is a 3-second pause, then the answer comes back. Send the turn. At 14:10 and 11 seconds, Mercer pushes a converging maneuver package to both carrier groups. Abraham Lincoln is ordered 26 degrees to port. Gerald Ford is ordered 24 degrees to starboard. Both carriers are to turn toward datum Echo 7, the midpoint box between their formations. And instead of away from the apparent threat axes they had just spent 2 minutes avoiding, it is the opposite of what an outsider would expect. It compresses the formation when everyone on the scope is conditioned to open distance from danger. That is why it works. Iran had calculated doctrine. It had not calculated disobedience from doctrine. At 14:10 and 19 seconds, Abraham Lincoln begins the turn. Gerald Ford follows 5 seconds later. The separation, which had climbed to 204 nautical miles, stops widening. At 14:10 and 31 seconds, Delbert D. Black launches 2 Nulka active decoys on the old outside tracks. USS Gerald launches 2 more 7 seconds later. The decoys do not need to look like carriers. They only need to preserve the geometry Iran thinks it is attacking for 1 more relay cycle. Yes, at 14:10 and 42 seconds, the 3 surface relays transmit again. Mercer logs the burst lengths: 0.5 seconds, 0.5 seconds, 0.4 seconds. The update went out, but it went to the wrong future. At 14:10 and 48 seconds, the first 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles crest and begin terminal descent. Ford's screen assigns 3 SM-6 interceptors. Lincoln's escorts assign 3 more. The firing solutions are not perfect because the warheads are not flying blind. They are receiving one last set of instructions from relay boats that think 2 carriers are still moving away from each other. What the system believed was happening was a standard dual-axis missile attack. What was actually happening was a race between the warhead's last update and the carrier's ability to invalidate it. But at 14:11 and 03 seconds, the first SM-6 detonates against the lead missile, descending on Gerald Ford's old projected track. Direct kill. The second interceptor misses the next warhead by 120 meters because the target corrects late toward the decoy corridor. The third detonates close enough to damage the airframe without fully destroying it. On Lincoln's side, 2 SM-6 kill 1 inbound weapon clean and push another into a degraded terminal profile. 2 warheads remain. Both are still inside the problem. At 14:11 and 14 seconds, Gerald Ford's damaged inbound track shifts 3.1 degrees toward the Nulka corridor. That movement tells Mercer the relay logic is still trying to solve the old geometry. She transmits one more recommendation, this time not to the air defense net, but directly to the bridge watch on both carriers. Maintain inward turn, yet do not reopen separation. If either carrier flinches back to its earlier heading, the old solution comes alive again. At 14:11 and 22 seconds, Ford's forward Phalanx CIWS acquires the damaged warhead at 5.8 nautical miles and fires the first burst. The stream cuts through the terminal lane and misses by 22 meters as the missile chases the decoy line. 5 seconds later, the second burst reaches it. The warhead breaks apart 2.1 nautical miles off Ford's port bow. Fragmentation and debris strike the water well outside the hull. On Abraham Lincoln's side, the last missile is worse. It had not been hit cleanly in mid-course. It is still descending at high speed, with one relay-fed solution left in memory. Lincoln's combat system now has 18 seconds. The Phalanx mount tracks. The fire control computer calculates. The first burst opens at 14:11 and 31 seconds. The rounds miss. The second burst starts 4 seconds later. Still no kill. The missile is not heading for where Abraham Lincoln is. It is diving toward where Abraham Lincoln would have been if Mercer had never sent the converging turn. At 14:11 and 39 seconds, the warhead passes 0.7 nautical miles down Lincoln's starboard quarter and impacts open water 640 meters aft of the carrier's previous projected line. The blast wave throws spray across the stern, injures 6 sailors on exposed stations, and buckles one non-critical deck fitting. The hull is intact. The deck is intact. The ship keeps moving. At 14:11 and 46 seconds, the separation between Abraham Lincoln and Gerald Ford is back down to 191 nautical miles. The overlap never fully breaks. The formation never splits. And that is the moment the American response stops being reactive and becomes merciless. Mercer has the relay bearings, the burst timing, and the 3 surface contacts that made the entire attack possible. An MH-60R already airborne from USS. Michael Murphy is pushed south with the relay coordinates at 14:12 and 03 seconds. Its radar picks up the first contact 9 nautical miles ahead of the projected lane. The aircraft confirms a low-profile vessel with civilian contours and a retractable antenna mast. At 14:13 and 11 seconds, the Seahawk fires the first AGM-114 Hellfire. The second follows 4 seconds later. The relay vessel breaks apart and loses power before it can transmit again. The helicopter crews turn to the second contact and destroy it 3 minutes later. The third tries to run west at 18 knots and is finished by naval gunfire from Spruance at 14:18 and 42 seconds. While the relay boats are dying, Mercer backtracks the burst geometry through the centerline timing and derives the command source on shore. Not the launchers, not the radars. The coordination cell, the place where Iran had paired decoy timing, relay cycles, and terminal missile baskets into one attack designed to pull 2 U.S. carriers away from each other with their own correct defensive behavior. She has the coordinates at 14:16 and 9 seconds. Rear Admiral Carver authorizes the strike 48 seconds later. 6 BGM-109 Tomahawks launch at 14:18 and 02 seconds from 3 destroyers in the screen. 2 FA-18F Super Hornets already armed on Abraham Lincoln. In the same deck Iran had tried to isolate by breaking the 2-carrier overlap, are redirected against the mobile missile launchers the moment the relay network goes dark. The first Tomahawk reaches the coordination bunker at 14:41 and 26 seconds. The second and third hit the fiber relay building and generator yard 11 seconds later. The fourth, fifth, and sixth arrive over the next 17 seconds and erase what remains of the control node that had spent weeks studying American carrier maneuver doctrine well enough to weaponize it. At 14:52 and 08 seconds, the Super Hornets destroy 2 Obile launchers, with GBU-31 JDAMs as they attempt to leave the coast road. By 1504, both carrier groups are back on scheduled combat operations. Abraham Lincoln resumes flight activity 52 minutes after first detection. Gerald Ford resumes in 49. No ship is lost. Yet no formation breaks. Iran's plan that afternoon was never simply to hit USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald Ford with missiles. The real plan was to use a first wave of expendable drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic decoys to force two carriers into opposite defensive turns, stretch the distance between them past the point where their shared air defense picture lost coherence, and then fire the real anti-ship weapons into the space created by that separation. It was an attack on geometry disguised as an attack on steel. It failed because one warrant officer whose job had nothing to do with commanding ships understood that the gap between the carriers mattered more than the contacts on the screen, saw the relay logic before the rest of the force understood what it meant, and forced both strike groups to turn toward the one place Iran had assumed they would never go. The relay boats were gone. The bunker was gone. The launchers were gone. The ships never stopped fighting. And the one variable Iran did not account for was Claire Mercer, the officer who knew the system was not defending two carriers at all, but the distance between them.